The local Somali community has expressed that they're facing significant backlash due to the investigation. As of 6:42 a.m. in St. Paul, Minnesota, the temperature had dropped well below freezing. The streets of the southern district were eerily quiet, save for the idle exhaust fumes coming from 3 unmarked federal SUVs parked by the curb. Inside these vehicles were 11 federal inspectors from both the FBI and the Department of Health and Human Services. Their presence was not for a drug bust, nor were they chasing any fugitives. On the surface, this was just a routine compliance inspection at a state-licensed daycare facility. The daycare was managed by Amina Farah Hassan, a 45-year-old woman whose reputation had never raised any red flags. She was known to run 5 different daycare centers across the Twin Cities, looking after more than 820 children each day. Thanks to her sizable enrollment numbers, her facility received timely government subsidies, which seemed to be running smoothly. But there was a darker reality lurking just beneath the surface. Federal agents had already raided one of her daycare centers located in South Minneapolis. It was suspected that her business had been billing the government under false pretenses for years. Over the span of 4 years, her network had received a staggering $2.8 billion in taxpayer-funded subsidies. When the agents stepped out of their vehicles and approached the front door of the daycare center, something felt off. The building stood in silence. No parents were dropping off children, no sounds of laughter, no life. The windows were dark and the usual hustle and bustle of a daycare were absent. The lead inspector unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air was cold and stale, and immediately it felt wrong. The toys were neatly arranged on the shelves, but they were covered in a thin layer of dust. The cribs in the nursery were perfectly assembled, yet the mattresses were untouched, pristine, as if no children had ever laid in them. Attendance sheets were pinned to the wall, each one filled out meticulously in blue ink, but the names and boxes checked off seemed hollow. It was clear that this room had never seen the chaos of a busy daycare. Despite receiving over $46 million in taxpayer subsidies in the past year, not a single child had spent a full day there. Inside the director's office, the fraud became undeniable. A thick binder lay on the desk, filled with the names of over 700 children, all part of a fraudulent roster. As the investigators flipped through the pages, they were stunned to see that the names weren't just random. They were fake identities, created using real Social Security numbers stolen from the dark web, along with forged birth certificates printed in a backroom operation. They had built an entire network of ghost children who existed only in the state's payment system, allowing Amina and her associates to continue siphoning millions of dollars from the government. However, the discovery didn't stop there. In a corner of the office, bolted to the floor, was a steel safe. When it was finally opened by a forensic locksmith, the agents found something far more sinister. Inside, alongside ledgers detailing financial records, were stacks of cash, $38 million in shrink-wrapped bundles. But it wasn't just the money that shocked the investigators. Sitting on top of the piles were 5 packages, each stamped with the Scorpion logo, a symbol tied to the infamous CJNG cartel. It was at this moment that the investigators realized the full scope of the operation. Amina Farah Hassan wasn't just running a daycare. She was running a money laundering operation for one of the world's most dangerous criminal organizations, all funded by American taxpayers. The investigation quickly turned into something far more serious. This wasn't just welfare fraud, it was a network fueling transnational crime, impacting the lives of countless people, especially the children it was supposed to protect. By the end of the morning, the scale of the fraud became clearer. Agents delved deeper into the records tied to the facility's licensing, and what they uncovered was even more damning. Samira Abdi Hassan, a relative listed as the co-director, was found to be managing multiple sites at the same time, and birth dates of the children overlapped, suggesting that the operation was far more complex than initially believed. But the real kicker came when investigators discovered that from 2021 to 2025, the network had received over $2.8 billion in total reimbursements, with some months seeing deposits of over $74 million, and these funds were funneled through 43 intermediary accounts before being redistributed and less than 4% of the funds could be traced to legitimate operational expenses like food, rent, or payroll. The rest, it was all routed overseas. The money was being moved to East Africa, the Middle East, and through shell companies in Mexico. The fraud didn't persist because it was well hidden. It thrived because it appeared so normal, so mundane. The investigators learned that much of this was happening under the radar of the system designed to prevent it. The checks and balances were automated, and what looked like efficiency in the welfare system turned out to be a perfect environment for exploitation. The network operated with ruthless precision, utilizing multiple financial accounts to obscure the path of the money. Behind the carefully filled out forms and the smooth operation of the network was a financial juggernaut that drained billions from the system. To make things even more bizarre, investigators discovered that the daycare centers had employed elaborate tactics to deceive neighbors and inspectors. Digital files belonging to Amina revealed a schedule labeled simulation shifts, which outlined the rotation of actors hired to park cars in the parking lot during child drop-off hours. The entire scene was a Hollywood-like production. They even went as far as installing outdoor speakers hidden in the bushes that played pre-recorded sounds of children laughing and playing, making it seem as though the daycare was full of life. They also maintained a fleet of car seats that were moved between different vehicles to add to the illusion. It wasn't just a scam. It was an act designed for a single audience, the state inspectors. The entire operation was a carefully orchestrated performance that ensured the money kept flowing, all while children, the very ones the system was designed to protect, were left without care. By late evening, the investigation shifted gears. It was no longer just an audit. It became a manhunt. At 11:58 p.m., federal prosecutors authorized a coordinated operation. The time for inspections had passed. This was now a sweep. Within minutes, teams were mobilizing across Minneapolis. The authorities raided not just one facility, but all 5 daycare centers run by Amina and her network. An additional 12 affiliated offices were also breached simultaneously. The State Department of Children, Youth, and Families, which licenses daycare facilities, refused to comment on the raids, but the scale of what investigators were uncovering became undeniable. As agents moved through the various buildings, alarms triggered throughout the financial network. Money began to move at a frantic pace. In less than 18 minutes, more than $96 million was rerouted through hidden financial tunnels, structures designed to collapse the moment they were activated. It was clear someone on the other end knew the feds were coming. Confirmation of Amina's involvement arrived when surveillance footage captured her leaving her home hours earlier. License plate readers tracked her vehicle heading south, and maritime records indicated a private vessel scheduled to depart before dawn. She was on the run, but the investigation wasn't over. It had led authorities to a darker location. At 2:18 a.m., an encrypted communications trace revealed a hub located 30 miles outside the city. The location appeared to be an industrial property listed as abandoned. Tax records showed no activity, but utility records told a different story. There had been a significant increase in electricity usage every night, and water consumption was off the charts, exceeding 90,000 gallons per day. At 3:36 a.m., aerial surveillance confirmed the worst fears of investigators. There was activity at the site. Vehicles were entering the compound at timed intervals, and exhaust plumes were rising from multiple vents. This wasn't a warehouse, it was a fully operational factory, and it was funded entirely by the stolen money meant to care for Minnesota's children. The operation was ramping up quickly. By 12:21 a.m., tactical teams were in place, ready to breach the compound. The primary objective was clear: entry. The quiet hum of the night was broken by floodlights slicing through the darkness as the teams moved toward the compound's main access points. This wasn't the entry into a typical warehouse. It had been fortified. The first breach came quietly, with a controlled charge on the steel door, and once it was opened, agents were hit with a wall of heat and a strange metallic taste in the air. The building's atmosphere wasn't just uncomfortable, it was toxic. Industrial scrubbers ran at full capacity, seemingly to hide any chemical signature from thermal satellites overhead. Inside, the investigators found something even more shocking than the operation they had already uncovered. Conveyor belts were still moving, and production counters continued to tick forward as if business were running as usual. But deeper inside the compound, the true horror was revealed. Behind a secondary corridor, agents stumbled upon a dimly lit holding room where 61 individuals were kept. Some were American citizens, but others came from different countries. Many had been reported missing for months. The sight of these individuals, malnourished and terrified, shocked even the most seasoned investigators. One man had a pulse barely above 40 beats per minute. These workers weren't just laborers, they were prisoners. Their fingerprints had been burned off with acid to ensure that they couldn't be identified if they ever managed to escape. The cartel had taken extreme precautions to ensure their workers couldn't report the conditions they were being subjected to. As rescue teams began extracting the captives, evidence teams pushed forward into the production areas. What they found there left them in stunned silence. The stolen daycare funds had been used to purchase precursor chemicals for a massive drug manufacturing operation. Ledgers showed purchases exceeding $1.4 billion over an 18-month period. The factory was churning out 32 to 38 tons of fentanyl per day and more than 70 tons of cocaine each week. The scope of the operation was almost incomprehensible. This was a closed loop of crime. The government paid for daycare centers. The daycare centers funneled the money into the hands of the cartel, and the cartel produced drugs that ravaged communities. It was a vicious cycle that had been hidden in plain sight for years. By 4:19 a.m., the scale of the operation was undeniable. Production floors extended over 4 levels of the facility. One line item in the ledgers listed a single week's worth of output valued at over $3.2 billion. As dawn approached, the compound was under full control. The silence that followed was heavy, a sign of just how vast and brutal the operation had been. At 10:26 a.m., federal briefings were set up in a secured building. The damage was far more severe than anyone could have imagined. The total confirmed financial loss to taxpayers had risen to over $4.3 billion. This figure represented the funds that were meant to protect vulnerable children, but instead, it had been siphoned away into criminal hands. Worse still, investigators learned that more than 68,000 low-income children across Minnesota had lost access to daycare services as a result of this fraud. Legitimate daycare providers had been driven out of business because they couldn't compete with an operation that didn't have to pay for food, staff, or facilities. In some neighborhoods, the closure of licensed child care centers had led to a nearly 22% reduction in available daycare spaces. But what was even more troubling than the financial loss was the systemic failure. The state's welfare system had not been blind to the fraud. It had simply chosen not to see it. Oversight had become procedural. Approvals had become automatic, and speed was prioritized over thoroughness. The system, originally designed to be efficient and responsive, had become vulnerable to exploitation. The focus on accessibility, on getting money to families quickly, had blinded authorities to the need for verification and accountability. The ghost child network had weaponized the very compassion that the welfare system was built on. They understood the bureaucracy, they knew the system's weaknesses, and they took advantage of it to steal billions. The case of Amina Farah Hassan served as a wake-up call, proving that some of the most dangerous criminals don't always look the part. They aren't always the ones lurking in the shadows. Sometimes they look like pillars of the community. They follow the rules, file the paperwork, and smile in the face of authority, all while quietly stealing the future right out from under the most vulnerable. The drug factory was shut down. The stolen money was frozen. But the investigation raised even more questions. How many other daycare centers are sitting empty right now, collecting millions in taxpayer dollars, while children continue to go without care? How many other operations are out there siphoning off money meant for the most vulnerable while escaping scrutiny? If you believe that there needs to be a complete audit of every welfare program in the country to prevent something like this from happening again, then we need to keep pushing for accountability. This case should be a lesson that fraudsters will always find ways to exploit weaknesses in the system, and that complacency can have disastrous consequences. The public needs to demand transparency, and lawmakers need to take a hard look at how the system operates. Only through vigilance and reform can we ensure that this doesn't happen again. The arrests are ongoing, and the pursuit of justice is just beginning. The investigation has exposed not just a network of criminal activity, but a deep systemic vulnerability that can be exploited anywhere. The future of welfare programs and childcare services in America could depend on the lessons learned from this massive scandal. We must stay vigilant, and we must demand accountability from those who are entrusted with the well-being of our children.